Hi everyone, and welcome to TLDR Week 13, Digital Forensics. The learning outcomes for the week is being able to explain what a digital investigation is, digital evidence, and the limitations of forensics, talk about how to design software that supports forensics, talk about the legal requirements for seized data and data collection, including proper storage, and how to recover data such as a deleted file. Now, this particular week, digital forensics, if you are a student at Northern Essex, as of fall 2020, we do actually have a full semester digital forensics class. This is normally run as a hybrid at night. And if you end up being really interested in forensics after this week and looking at the module and everything that is here, you might want to consider taking that class. So let's start with what is computer forensics. So the idea behind computer forensics is very much like the idea of regular forensics, like you might see in TV shows, and how they are going to go about solving crimes based on physical evidence. Computer forensics takes that a step further and looks at how we can solve crimes using computers. Now, this is actually starting to become more and more important. The more computers are spread out across our everyday lifestyles, the more opportunities we have to be able to use them in forensic investigations. One of the things we have to be worried about is making sure that we are collecting evidence in a forensically sound manner. So this can be anything from how to carefully copy information from a computer without ruining the information, to also what you are allowed to take into the courtroom. Now, this is something that is actually frequently changing, and as of summer of 2020, there have been several cases where they have gotten evidence using things like Alexa, Google Home, and some of the IoT devices that a lot of people have in their homes. There's also been some cases where the Amazon Ring, the video doorbell, has been brought in and used to prove or disprove other pieces of evidence. Now, it's really important that if you have something like that, you are following all of the current laws and procedures. And it's also important to make sure that when you are following them, you are following them very closely and exactly so that your evidence doesn't get thrown out of the courtroom. Computer forensics can actually be used beyond just criminal investigations. So it is true that police officers and government is going to want to use computer forensics to be able to catch people who are criminals. So, for example, if we're trying to say catch somebody who's a drug dealer, we are probably going to assume that they are using some kind of computer to conduct their business. Now, this could be anything from an Excel spreadsheet of all of their customers to one of the more recent cases where a very enterprising dealer decided to start taking credit card payments for his illegal drugs. Now, beyond just criminals, however, we'll actually see computer forensics being used in court cases and corporate IT. Computer forensics is actually something that you'll see frequently in corporate IT, especially in the information security world, because that's part of how we're able to figure out what has actually happened in the case of a data breach. So if we have a company that has been attacked, we actually use computer forensics to figure out what they hit in the attack, what was changed, if anything, how they got in there, and those footprints in the sand, as it were, is actually something that's really important so that we can make sure that the mitigation for the attack is done properly. There are actually several careers that you could have in computer forensics. You could go for police and law enforcement. There's not as many jobs, but there are more coming. What we're seeing as of, again, summer 2020, is that the police officers are currently in part of a defund the police movement and by part of, I mean people are saying we should be defunding the police. So it is unlikely that they are going to be getting a lot more funding for things like specialized forensic analysis. So what we have right now is there's a few places in Massachusetts that actually do computer forensics, but it's not really widespread in every police department. However, if you look at some of the government agencies, they will have entire divisions that will do computer forensics, and that can be a really good way to get a job if this is interesting to you. You'll also see some places in corporate IT, generally for the larger companies, that are going to have either the entire job or a portion of the job would be computer forensics, trying to figure out what's happened. So this can be attacks, successful or unsuccessful, that you're trying to track back and figure out what people were attacking and why. Now, when we talk about digital evidence, there's different kinds of evidence. We're going to obviously have the evidence of, say, disk drives, USBs, things like that. However, it's very much expanded beyond that. Right now, what's happened is the digital evidence that a lot of people are going to be looking at is actually coming from people's cell phones. Cell phones have the ability to track a surprising amount of data, including things like location, places that you frequently stop at, websites that you frequently go to, searches that you've done, and even things like if you take, a run or a walk in the morning regularly, or where you might have frequent drop zones, things like that. Cell phones are actually going to keep all of that together. So if you can get somebody's cell phone, you basically have a tag on that person, because most people have a smartphone in this day and age, and they take that smartphone with them everywhere. Now, digital evidence can actually come from other places as well. So I have the example of IoT devices, Internet of Things, and that's going to be things like some of the speakers that we'll see. That can be pulled in for evidence because those can actually have snippets of recordings. You might have evidence coming from anything like, say, a light bulb. Was your light turned on? Who turned it on? Were you supposed to be there or not supposed to be there? A lot of people have started doing more with cameras on their properties. So they'll have cameras inside or outside, or camera doorbells, things like that. And that can also be part of digital evidence as well. We could also see things like even game systems have been brought in as digital evidence. There's been incidents where people have been playing games online, and it's actually the background recording has recorded things like assaults and beatings, and then they were able to actually figure out like who was there and what was happening, and be able to get more information about that crime. One of the things we have to worry about with digital evidence is something called volatile data. What this means, when you have a regular computer, you have the hard drive, which when you power it off, all of the information stays. So even if you have a computer that hasn't been started up for a week, all of the information you had on the hard drive continues to stay on the hard drive. Something like RAM, however, the memory in your computer, random access memory, that's considered volatile data. As soon as the power goes off, you know that that data is going to start getting erased. And it might take an hour, it might take a day, but that data is going to go away. What makes that kind of data so valuable is that gives you a very clear picture of what that computer was doing at that exact moment in time. So if, for example, you have a computer from, let's say, a criminal, you're able to seize the computer, it's actually considered best practices to not turn the computer off before you can actually do things like copy RAM, copy the caches, and make sure that nothing is going to disappear, because then you can see exactly what that person was doing at the moment in time that they stopped. Steps of an investigation. So we have to make sure that we are identifying, collecting, and preserving evidence. It's really important that you are making sure that you aren't ruining the evidence by working with it. You want to make sure that you're doing the proper steps for evidence reporting. And then if this is going into any variety of a courtroom, you have to make sure that you are able to give testimony in a way that they will accept. One example of this, let's say we're talking about using a particular software, and there's a brand new software on the market that alleges it can do all of these amazing things for picking up information from a computer. Now, the software very well might do that, but if it's never been used in court before, you actually have to make an argument for why this software should be admissible evidence and why it should be able to use this as admissible evidence, which is actually a lot more work than just bringing in evidence from the tried and true methods. It's kind of like if you think about regular forensics, most people accept things like blood spatter analysis and fingerprinting. However, if you wanted to do something that was very outside of the norm, then you would have to make an argument for why that was relevant. You have to do the same thing with computer forensics. When we have a computer, one of the things that makes this a little different than regular forensics is we should be able to copy all of the data. We make what's called a forensically correct copy. That means we are actually taking an exact copy of the data, and as we are doing our analysis of the data, at the end, we have to be able to prove that we have made 0 changes. So we have to be able to prove that the data that we're working with is the exact same data as what was copied from the computer. Because if we're going to be doing computer forensics, we're never going to be working with the actual computer. We're always going to be working with that copy, so that if something does go wrong or there is an accident, we don't have to worry about ruining the original. You're also probably going to be using special software and special hardware. For example, there's something called a toaster. It very literally looks like a regular toaster that you put bread in, except instead of bread, you put in hard drives. You'll also see some places, very commonly governments, R&D places, that are going to want to forensically wipe drives, which means they want to prevent somebody from being able to do a full copy of their drive that we are trying to do. And they'll sometimes do this for safety. Security hashes, if you remember when we talked about cryptography a couple of weeks ago, the one-way hash is how we are able to fingerprint a file. You can actually do the same thing with hard drives. You can fingerprint a hard drive, and that's actually how we can prove that we haven't made any changes. Most companies that are large enough will have CERT teams. Now, the original CERT was Computer Emergency Response Team, and people tend to get a little worried when you say emergency, so they actually switched this to be CERT team, CSIRT, and in that case we're actually saying it's Computer Security Incident Response Team, so we started calling it incidences instead of emergencies. So what these teams do is they are the ones that are going to implement whatever plan has been decided on when something happens. And I don't mean something happens like we've been hacked and we know it. I mean like if anything goes wrong, if we have any unexpected behavior that is widespread, we might want to call in this team. Now, this team is going to be made up of stakeholders from all departments, and it also has to have somebody from the C-suite to make sure that we have somebody of sort of the correct power structure to approve any decisions. You have to make sure that you are prioritizing incidences and also having a plan in place for if something goes wrong. For example, let's say we have a company, they have a mission critical system, and we think that that mission critical system has been hacked. It's a bank and the system that takes all payments and loans. Very, very serious. However, if we take this mission critical system down while we are doing any analysis, we are no longer able to collect loans, we aren't able to do any input and output of money, and for a bank that's pretty fundamental. So we have to have a way of being able to figure out what our plan is so that we don't have to take that mission critical system down. After an incident has happened, we want to make sure that we have a forensic copy, keeping track of logs and history, so that we can track back after we have the time. The first thing that we need to worry about is, oh noes, something has happened. What do we do to mitigate? Afterwards, we want to go back and say, okay, post-mortem on the incident. What happened? What went wrong? How did they get in? How is this data lost? Was this a bug? Was this malicious? And the way that we're able to do that analysis is by looking at the forensic copy, the logs, and the history. A huge portion of all of this is reports and documentation. You have to document absolutely everything that you're doing, from the original plan of what should be happening when the incident, whatever the incident is, what was the plan for how to fix it, all the way into the executive summaries for what you did to fix it, what you did to track back what happened. Everything needs to be documented. You never want to have anything just living in somebody's head. After the incident, you want to make sure that you're taking part of your postmortem to figure out what you can do to prevent this in the future. A postmortem meeting is something that's pretty commonly done in companies after large projects, after incidents, so that we can do it as a look back. This isn't a blame game. This is, let's look back and see what's been happening and what we could do better in the future. So let's say we had an incident, going back to the bank example. Well, it turns out for this bank example, it actually wasn't a hacker. There was an unpatched program, and that ended up leading to a small leak of data. So what can we do to fix this in the future? Why did this go unpatched? Was this we didn't have enough personnel? Was this we didn't have the time for it? Was it we put it off because we were afraid it was going to break other things, or so many emergency things were happening that we didn't have the time to do basic maintenance and hardening? What policies can we change to prevent this from happening in the future? Please let me know if you have any questions.